This is what you do when you've just found that statement handbag on eBay and you want to build an entire wardrobe around it. You start selling to keep buying. Yep, on eBay. Over that all-black everything phase? List it and buy all the color. Feeling more vintage than ever? It's out with the new and in with the pre-loved. Next thing you know, you've refreshed your wardrobe basically without spending a dime. Yeah, eBay, the place to buy and sell new, pre-loved, vintage, and rare fashion.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. The holidays are here, and you know what that means. It's time to get your friends and family the gifts they deserve. Take the stress out of shopping with Amazon's great deals and low prices on a huge range of items from toys to tech and much more. Whoever you're gifting for, Amazon has great prices on everything you need this holiday season. Shop early holiday deals now.
It's October 28th, 1726, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Upon its publication, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe was a smash hit largely for its inspiring portrayal of a plucky castaway who turns a desert island into his own little corner of England. But Gulliver's Travels, published a few years later, Today in History in 1726, offered a very different depiction of an English mariner confronted with exotic lands, one far less flattering to the Anglo-Saxon ego.
Yeah, substantially less flattering. I mean, some readers saw this as a scandalous satire, even blasphemous. And the text of Gulliver's Travels, I mean, you forget because it's so beloved of children in its abridged form. But it does, denounce colonialism. It makes the monarchy look ridiculous. Gulliver literally pisses on the Queen's house, after all, to put out a fire. And there were a lot of people that found this quite triggering. Thackeray described part 4 of the book as, quote, filthy in word, filthy in thought, furious, raging, obscene. And yet, it was an absolutely enormous sensation.
Yeah, and you sort of get the sense that some of that filth and outrage was born because of the way the project came about. Because Gulliver's Travels wasn't just the work of Swift at the beginning, but it kind of was a group project. Because the idea originated with a thing called the Scriblerus Club, which was a group that included Jonathan Swift, but also John Gay, Alexander Pope, and John Arbuthnot, all these sort of luminaries of their era, writers and wits, who were devoted themselves to satirizing what they perceived as the folly of modern scholarship and science. And even though the travels were originally inspired by these scriblarians, as they called themselves, it was actually Swift who fully developed the idea into this sort of travel narrative with his Scriblerus-like character, who was Gulliver, then embarking on this series of fictional journeys that does get increasingly mad as it goes along. I mean, it's no surprise that we know his first journey the best, because it's the most sort of straightforward and, going to a land of short people and then going to a land of giants, those first 2 chapters, you kind of understand. But then it does take a pretty loopy turn from there.
Well, you'd understand.
Right.
I'm waiting for the second half of your life where you're surrounded by people who will dwarf you.
That will be an unexpected turn of events.
Despite this kind of patchwork beginning, what emerged as Gulliver's Travels published on this day was an extremely dedicated pastiche of the travelogue form. This original edition even contained a fake portrait of the author, Lemuel Gulliver, and the book contains a wealth of biographical detail, the kind that you would expect in a real memoir. You've got Gulliver's family pedigree, he talks about his education and his training as a surgeon. There's information about his wife and children, and even the full title, Travels into Several Remote Nations of the World in 4 parts, by Lemuel Gulliver, first a surgeon and then a captain of several ships, follows what would have been to readers at the time a very familiar style, whereby the writer they would sort of include their credentials within the title of the book. There's even maps inside with the location of places like the island of Lilliput, which he places in the ocean northwest of Tasmania. So there are a lot of kind of meta details about the narrative that make it feel real. And, we kind of touched on the fact that Swiftian satire is usually understood to be very dry and understated to the point that the book can easily be kind of adapted for children. And such is the case here. The adventures are very outlandish, but there's no obvious winking to the audience a lot of the time. Swift does play it quite straight, and his mastery of the style did lead some people to believe that if it was not exactly authentic, it was at least being written by a real person.
Yeah, I mean, he'd consumed an enormous amount of travel literature himself. We know that from the sales catalogue of his personal library. So I think he took that bit of the brief pretty seriously, doing a parody of Robinson Crusoe. But that's just funny in itself on so many levels, partly because, as we discussed in our episode of Robinson Crusoe itself is kind of like a parody on the sort of memoir someone might write if they were real, but it isn't real. But also because, it sort of takes Gulliver's Travels, which is now seen as this great piece of satire, this foundational piece of literature, and puts it in the context of being, from a publishing point of view, not really any different to those kind of rushed parodies of political memoirs that you get these days, so you'll get someone copying Boris Johnson's front page, except it'll be called Bellend or whatever, and they'll put it next to it in the bookshelf. It's basically, it's as puerile it's as puerile a joke as that, isn't it? It's like, ha ha ha, here's a parody of Robinson Crusoe. Imagine what would happen if someone went to a completely fantastical land. And yet, there is biting satire in it. And so it was important for Jonathan Swift, who at this time was Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, not to attach his name to it. Or at least, the literary circles that he was moving in, Arion, like you mentioned before, they all knew it was him, really.
Yeah.
But the general public didn't. And the true identity of the author was genuinely concealed from the publisher, Benjamin Mott. The manuscript was handed over under the cover of night.
Yeah, that's right, because Swift really knew that this book was potentially politically pretty volatile. And so he had this kind of presentation to his potential publisher where he discreetly sent the book through along with a letter requesting the publication of Gulliver's Travels, which I think is all very polite for starters. And it was signed by Gulliver's fictional cousin, Richard Simpson. And Simpson is also the author of a prefatory letter in the book. So there's already some blurring of the boundaries between fact and fiction. You have this sort of like real life dealings with his publisher going on, but he's already adopted the character of the person who writes the introduction. So he's kind of hiding
like a Marvel
himself.
Extended Universe, isn't it, of Gulliver?
Yeah, exactly. So Mott, having read it, was pretty eager to publish Gulliver's Travels because he could recognise its quality. And ultimately, it was released incredibly quickly on this day in 1726. And in fact, so quickly that Swift didn't have the opportunity to correct the proof copies before they went to print. And so when the book was published, he was really horrified to find that it was riddled with misprints and that Mott had actually intentionally altered a bunch of passages, either to tone things down a little bit because he thought that they were going to be a bit provocative, or just because he didn't quite like it and Swift hadn't had a chance to see what his editor had done with it. And so he was completely incensed about this infringement on his personal authorial rights. And many of the misprints were corrected in subsequent editions, but it wasn't until 1735 that Mott's extensive edits, these sort of his own fingerprint, as it were fully removed.
The most popular passage in the Travels then as now was the encounter early on with the Lilliputians, the race of tiny people. Most of us can instantly picture, either from book illustrations or the movie versions, Gulliver tied down by little hordes of tiny folk.
Or a visit to Gulliver's Land in Milton Keynes.
Not all of us have been so lucky.
You've missed out.
And even that, though, is that, it's very, very richly satirical in a way that obviously most of us will probably not remember from reading, sort of abridged versions of children. The general theme of the encounter, the one that we can all kind of pick up on, is that, they see themselves as the norm and Gulliver as a freak. It's this constant theme through the Travels of challenging cultural assumptions of what's normal and superiority. And obviously this is a time when Britain is starting to expand its dominion across the globe, so you can see how that would be considered a little bit politically dicey. But also some of the satirical observations are so couched in the specific social and political context of the 1720s that it is almost impossible for a modern reader to understand. The Lilliputians.
I don't know what you mean. I spend all my time swatting up on the Spanish War of Succession before I read a comic book.
Well, I think the Lilliputians, you probably don't remember this because we probably all read versions that were like 10 pages long,
yeah.
But they have political parties that were supposed to be parodies of the Whigs and the Tories, and their major division in the Travels is about which end of the boiled egg should be cracked. This is poking fun at religious sectarianism. The big Endians represent the Catholics and the little Endians represent the Protestants. So you can see how this is the kind of thing that would go over the head of the casual reader, or indeed the reader who's not living in 1720s Britain.
Yeah, but I think that the reason why we might be confused about what exactly he was satirizing is because even readers at the time might have been a bit uncertain about it. Just 2 weeks after Gulliver's Travels came out, newspapers were advertising a key being observations and explanatory notes upon the travels of Lemuel Gulliver.
How to solve a Rubik's Cube of its day.
It was, yeah. It was like their handbook.
Imagine you're like reading each line of the book, and then you're like looking at your key and being like,
Exactly.
I mean, that said, though, not everybody thought this was the last word in satirical brilliance. Writing 50 years later, Samuel Johnson witheringly remarked, "Once you have thought of big men and little men, it is very easy to do all the rest." The thing about Gulliver's Travels is that because we sort of remember it in a very episodic, selective way, the general message has kind of fallen by the wayside, but it's a very bleak satire and a
Very
mean
bleak.
satire.
Yes.
Like Swift was nicknamed the Gloomy Dean because he had this misanthropic, bleak vision of humanity, and it ends it's almost like a Black Mirror episode. Gulliver is sort of, his spirit is broken by this encounter. He now sees humans as savages, and the memoir ends with him living as a recluse back in England, shunning his wife and children to spend hours in the stables talking to his horses. It's like a very unpleasant note to end on.
Perfect progenitor for Yahoo News and their suite of products.
Is this an ad?
The word Yahoo, that's a significant contribution to the culture, isn't it?
Oh, is that where? Wait, did it come from? I always thought it was a cry of excitement. Did it actually come from?
It actually came from this, as did the
Stop
word
it.
Lilliputian, meaning small, miniature humans.
I could put that one together.
Yeah, we're not total idiots, Olly.
Yahoo came from Swift's brain, yes. Remember that next time your grandma sends you an email.
Tomorrow.
2 unemployed Florida Beach boys and a skin diver known as Murph the Surf.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/Retrospectors.